All right. Well, here we are in continuing in our series, and today we encounter the book of Judges in the Old Testament. Again, it's one of the larger parts of one of the smaller parts of the larger genre of historical books. But this one's the book of Judges. So, James, tell us why is it called the book of Judges, and what is a judge?
Well, it's called Judges because it's the judges are the main characters of the book. The judges are the deliverers of Israel. They're rulers, but they're not kings because they don't pass on their authority through their children. So they're just a one-time person who is raised up by God and called of God to deliver the people from their oppressors. That's principally what they do in the book of Judges. And I suppose they're called judges because the law of the land is the law of God. And in that sense, they would be chief enforcers or adjudicators of the law.
Right.
And so they're called judges, but
not judges in the sense that we think of behind a bench with a black robe and a gavel. And
no, not at all. These are warriors.
Okay.
For the most part. These are people who God raises up to throw off their enemies and then to rule effectively as an executive than a judge.
Okay. Well, tell us about the context of this book. I mean, when was it? When does it take place in Israel? What time period does it cover? What's happening in Israel at the time? What does it point to us about Tell us about the context of Judges.
Judges takes us from the death of Joshua through the period until basically through into the book of Samuel. Because Ruth is a small book that takes place sometime within the time frame of the book of Judges. And it just describes the nation of Israel in the land before there was a king. And so and it really looks as if that is a part of the purpose of the book of Judges. It appears as if it was written at some time, either during Saul's reign or in the early part of David's reign. Before David had run the Jebusites out of Jerusalem, because there's a statement made somewhere in the book of Judges that the Jebusites are in Jerusalem to this day. But it almost reads as if it's if you were to ask the question, why do we need a king in Israel? Well, here's the book of Judges to explain why. Several times, 2 or 3 times in the book, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So in that sense, it's really a dark book. It's a book where Joshua ends on a theme of hope and looking to the future, and then Judges is just a cycle of the people forsaking God and chasing after other gods, and God sending them judgment, and then they cry out to God for a deliverer. God sends a deliverer, and then there's a time of prosperity and blessing, and of course they forget God again. And it's just the cycle over and over and over again. Okay.
Well, you mentioned a little bit about it, but tell us more about who wrote the book of Judges.
Well, we don't know for sure, but someone wrote it. It has a very prophetic voice and a prophetic feel to it, in the same way that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings do. And so traditionally, I think many people have ascribed it to someone like Samuel.
Okay.
May have come along. Samuel, who was the last of the judges, and he's the first one. He's also a prophet, and he anoints the first King Saul, and then he also anoints David. And so probably someone like him who wrote the book.
And so Samuel or someone like him would definitely have a favorable view toward the monarchy, right? So
yes.
This is someone in the future writing about past events with a favorable view toward the new and emerging monarchy.
Yes, and that appears to be the purpose of the book for the people, the original audience it was intended.
Okay, all right. Judges is definitely a controversial book as far as Christian scholars are concerned. There's a lot of stuff in there that makes us kind of drop our jaw. Tell us about some of the controversy in the book of Judges. What are we looking for?
Well, when you're young, and you're reading the book of Judges. I know when I read it early on, it was a very exciting book because it's action. It's nothing but action, action, action. And you're like, wow, there's these stories of these battles, these interesting stories about Gideon and Samson and all of these things. And so it's a very compelling read. And so we're very excited about Judges. And then as we get older, we start going, wow, is that really in the Bible? There's some things that kind of stand out. It's pretty gruesome.
As you mentioned, it's a dark book.
It is a very dark book, and it ends on a very awful note. It ends in a civil war and a lot of bloodshed and some horrific acts that take place that are just described in brutal honesty. And so the book of Judges is very raw and very honest. It's a very dark portrayal of what we are, how sinful we are. Does that answer your question? Because I've forgotten the question.
Yeah, it does. No, I was asking about the controversy, and that does answer the question, but I'm going to press a little bit more into the controversy here with a particular. At the end of the book of Judges, or near the end of the book of Judges, there's one judge described in his life and times named Jephthah. And Jephthah is a warrior judge. As you mentioned, almost all of them are warriors. He's a warrior judge raised up to deliver the people of Israel from their enemies, and in one of the battles in particular, Jephthah makes this vow to God. This is to whet your appetite a little bit as you begin to read it and look forward to this. So he makes this vow to God that whatever comes out of his house first, he will sacrifice to the Lord if the Lord will give him victory in battle. Well, the Lord does give Jephthah victory in battle. And when he returns home, the first thing to come out of his house is his own daughter.
Yes.
And the text tells us that he sacrifices his own daughter in order to fulfill that vow. And so my question to you, James, in this jaw-dropping kind of story, this dark story, did Jephthah really do that? Did he sacrifice his daughter? And if so, why did the Lord require that of him? And if not, then why does the Scripture tell us that he did?
Well, there is a school of thought that says that he did sacrifice her, but not as a burnt offering. And the idea goes like this, that God, of course, forbids human sacrifice in the law. So God is not going to require of him that which God forbids of him. And so his sacrifice would have been, in assuming that he doesn't have any sons, the only way for his land, his property to stay in his family, and for him to have progeny in the future and for his name to be kept alive is through his daughter. And now he has to give her up to a life sort of like a monastic life of living at the tabernacle and serving the Lord from now on, that she'll never have children. And we think, well, that's not much of it, but it really would have been a sacrifice to him. And so the school of thought goes that way. But it appears is from the Scripture that he really did sacrifice her, and it's as you said, it's a horrific thing. It's a horrific idea. He makes a rash vow to God. And what the Bible does oftentimes is it describes events as they happened. And it doesn't give a lot of comment on it. If we assume then that was okay with God, I don't think we have any right to assume that. There are many things that are described in Judges that are not normative. And really I think what it does is it shows the ignorance of the people during the time. That Jephthah, though he's listed as a man of faith because he had faith that God would give him the victory and faith that God would keep the promises that God had made, he shows an ignorance in his dealing with God, and that he thinks that God can be bargained with. We're taught nowhere in Scripture, in any teaching portion of the Scripture, that we bargain with God that way. In fact, we're taught the opposite.
Are there any other judges that try to bargain with God?
Sure, there's Gideon. Gideon in an example of, and he's listed as a great man of faith, but when we read about Gideon, we're reading doubt. God says, Gideon, I'm going to use you to deliver the people of Israel, and Gideon's like, I don't know, God, is this what you really mean? I tell you what, God, I'm going to put this fleece out on the ground, and in the morning, if I come out, if there's dew everywhere on the ground but not on the fleece, then I'll believe you. Well, that happens, And Gideon's still like, no, I think what I'm going to do this time is put the fleece out in the morning. I want all the dew on the fleece and none on the ground. And it just shows God's patience and how God is, it's just amazing that God puts up with us the way that he does.
Yeah.
And so Jephthah makes a rash vow to God, and I read that and I think, oh, that's terrible. Why not say to God, I've sinned a great sin in making this vow rashly. Don't take her life, take mine. But he doesn't do that. And you're just amazed. I mean, Samson. Samson is this, in Sunday school we read about Samson and his great faith and how God gives him this great strength and he delivers the people from the Philistines, and Samson is listed up to us.
The real story is a little different, isn't it?
Yes, when you actually read the story and you take those Sunday school glasses off, you see that Samson is, sure he has faith in God. He's basically a womanizer. I mean, Samson's whole life is one woman after the other that he just uses and does away with. He's always chasing after women that he shouldn't have. And then, he ends his life in faith, of course. But there's, other than his faith in God for strength to deliver the people from their enemies, there's not much moral quality to Samson's life at all.
Right.
And so we have this picture of these people who have a faith it's not grounded in knowledge. It's a very raw look at these people.
Right.
And so it's a very controversial book, and we look at it and go, wow.
Lots of controversy in there. Lots of darkness. A very grim view of humanity, isn't it?
Yes. It ends with a story that if you were to depict it in theaters the way it is described in the Bible, you would not want your children to see the movie.
You probably wouldn't even want to see it.
Yes. A man leaves his concubine outside and tells the people just take her and use her, and they rape her all night and leave her on the morning. She's on the doorstep, and then the man comes out in the morning and he takes her and throws her on the back of his donkey, and they ride off, and then he takes her and cuts her into 12 pieces and sends one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And you're reading this and your mouth is falling open and you're going, and wow. And then that leads to a civil war, because that is so horrific that even the people in that day are appalled that happened. And it leads to a civil war, and the book ends in this horrible civil war. And again, it just points to the fact that the writer is describing these events in such a way as to show the need of the people for a king. And so there it is.
Well, James, tell me, I mean, we're reading a book about such a dark time in Israel, about such a time of incredible depravity. What's the Christian supposed to take away from this?
I think that we should look in the book of Judges and we should see ourselves. We should see ourselves without grace. Now
that's kind of hard. I mean, as anyone in the Sunday school class will be reading through the book of Judges, they'll say, James, there's no way I'm that bad. I would never do those things.
We do that though. We read the Bible and we see the sin that people commit in the Bible, and we shake our heads and go, why are they unfaithful to God? Of course, at the moment we're reading, in our minds we are faithful to God because we're reading the Bible. And anybody who's reading the Bible in that moment, they're a good Christian. They're obviously, because they're reading the Bible. And so in our minds, we've got this image of ours, this self-image of, I'm a good Christian. I read the Bible. I go to church. But this shows us our heart for what it would be without God's grace.
There but for the grace of God go I.
Yes. And even in the cycles that take place. We do the same thing. In times when God is really, when we have good health, when we have wealth, when everything is going